Welcome to the SciFirst MovieTalk episode. So in this episode, I'll be discussing the 9th overall entry into the Halloween movie franchise, the 2007 slasher Halloween, the second out of 3 movies in the overall franchise to date to bear the same name, and indeed for me, the first of 4 remaining movies in the series I had still yet to see for the first time. So what a treat. The version of Halloween, this version of Halloween, is set in its own timeline, separately from the events of any previous movie in the series, being a remake of the original 1978 classic, originally directed by John Carpenter. This installment, directed by Rob Zombie, brings a new chapter of terror and a distinct vision to the characters and story first examined in the original, with a more gritty and gruesome facade. The movie follows the same basic framework Carpenter set forth in the aforementioned original, bringing many of the same characters to the forefront, and none more so than the series' antagonist, of course, serial killer Michael Myers, as played by Tyler Mane, and his younger sister Laurie Strode, as played in this retelling by Scout Taylor-Compton. This time around, we get to delve deeper into Michael's escalation and transformation into the terrifying and relentless killer he is destined to become, from events that shaped him throughout his childhood, where he is played by Daeg Faerch, to his eventual escape from the sanatorium he was placed after murdering his elder sister, in cold blood when he was just 10, and maybe a few more added to the list this time around. All under the watchful eye of Dr. Samuel Loomis, as played by Malcolm McDowell, we examine Michael's state of mind and witness an undescribable evil taking him over until one blood-soaked All Hallows Eve, when Michael looks to reunite with his sister, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake as he stalks her and her friends around the sleepy town of Haddonfield. So, this version of Halloween is certainly a different beast for sure, cut from a very different cloth to those previously entered into the franchise. This is a much more gritty, grimy, blunter take on the story, bringing a more terrifyingly ruthless Myers into the mix. Not necessarily any scarier as a result, perhaps being less of a horror, more of a character study perhaps, but certainly horrific at times. The film actually opts to expand at length the first 5 minutes or so of the original, weaving its own path while still building from the framework already established by Carpenter. Where the original established Michael as a dark force of evil relatively quickly, and furthermore through the rantings of Loomis thereafter, Zombie looks to bring us a more of the rationale, if you like, behind the events that transpired during Michael's childhood. A journey inside the mind of a serial killer in the making. A frightening idea. This certainly offered something we hadn't seen in the franchise up to this point, and I think it fairly worked well against this version of Michael Zombie was trying to showcase. A more hardened, focused product of evil. A direct force with an unquenchable desire and thirst for the kill that's built up as Michael escalates and evolves into the predator that he eventually becomes. There's certainly more backstory than we have had previously encountered within the franchise, which definitely brings an emotive approach. There's an amount of sympathy you do feel for Michael, odd as that may be, which does feel somewhat uneasy to digest given the evil that he does then become. There is certainly a more human element introduced, which gives the story a very grounded approach this time around. It's a ruthless movie. It doesn't hold back. Graphically brutal at times. Perhaps sometimes unnecessarily so, but this all speaks to Michael's deranged mind. Pushed to the edge with a thrill for the kill. By Halloween standards, the body count is extreme. At times it did perhaps feel more like a Friday the 13th than Halloween, but it certainly was a version of Michael that showcased his power. It is, when all's said and done, a more hardcore retelling of the original story, yet one which doesn't have the feel of a mindless or needless rehash. Its twists and turns don't feel they're like they're merely there to simply be different. they have purpose, and yes, where elements are taken direct from the original, they are undertaken with homage to Carpenter's work, whilst also adding a twisted slant that more than befits the overall tone Zombie is peddling. It certainly ensures it maintains its own way of doing things. It is a completely different breed, and although I would say that it certainly feels like a Halloween movie at its heart, this movie takes itself very seriously, and indeed with a more direct and shocking approach. More kills, more gore, but I would suggest less all-out horror. There's not quite the same build of tension as we have had previously, given that we get to know Michael this time around on a more intimate basis. But I would say that's all kind of part of the trade-off. It's more blunt in its approach to some of the characters and dialogue though, sometimes hard-hitting to a point, sometimes somewhat crass. Every teenager's a stoner, sex-craved, every other word's a profanity, and in terms of nudity, for what was actually really needed, it verged close as to being soft porn, especially with regards to the language used. There are times this approach certainly worked, and others that just felt saturated. I think it balanced itself out the end. It's Zombie's approach, perhaps, and it certainly didn't put me off. It is watchable for what it is. It's different, shall we say. But for as different as this was in terms of style and attitude towards Michael, it actually still felt like a Halloween movie at its core, which I think went a long way to making this feel like it could actually be part of the overall chronology, as mixed as it is. This was bolstered by the fact that Zombie continues to use Carpenter's original musical cues and themes throughout, which I can wholly get behind. There was certainly something comforting to hear those iconic notes mixed with a more hard-edged and spine-tingling score by Tyler Bates. The new cast, I thought, held their end up pretty well against the now very established characters they portray. It was never going to be an easy task to reinvent what the audience was already going to expect, and I think the film certainly has enough of its own direction to bring something new to the table. And while Taylor-Compton's portrayal as Laurie Strode was more strained than that of Jamie Lee Curtis, well, that was always going to be a tall order to accomplish, yeah? But instead the film rounds out more from the other characters, which provides more connectivity and involvement, spreading out more of the story over the film's overall run time. As a final point, it was actually quite interesting to note that Danielle Harris, who had previously played Jamie Lloyd in the 4th and the 5th Halloween movies, The Return and The Revenge of Michael Myers respectively, did in fact play Annie Brackett, one of Laurie's best friends in this retelling. And whilst not a direct link to the chronology of any of the previous movies in the franchise, it was an interesting experience to witness somebody who had previously gone up against Michael in another life do the same as a completely different character. Sadly, a little bit more of a generic performance in this outing, but perhaps, as she's also on the cast list for the next instalment, we'll see what's yet to come. Overall, whilst Rob Zombie's reimagining of the original 1978 horror classic Halloween never really achieves the same level of suspense or skin-crawling tension, it nonetheless stands on its own merits as one of the more enjoyable, honest, if but rough and grimy installments within the overall franchise. Although essentially retelling the original story, using many of the same characters, ideas, and settings, it certainly managed to add its own flair, that while sometimes can be quite heavy, perhaps even excessive for what was actually needed, there are still plenty of unexpected moments that never feel like they've been added simply just for the sake of being different. It has its own way of going about things and never seeks to apologise for that. It has a distinctly individualistic energy. Its gritty, brutal and often gory approach actually ends up being quite refreshing. It's a different yet familiar take on Michael that I found yields a very satisfying result. Certainly a more adult version, serious and certainly hard-hitting at times. It is not one for the faint of heart, But I found it to be more than enjoyable and worthy attempt to reinvent, reinvigorate and re-establish Michael as one of the great icons of horror that he deserves to be. So, that brings me to the end of this episode. Many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a like. Please do hit that subscribe button for more movie reviews, trailer reactions and other movie-related content. Absolutely loved having you at SciFirst MovieTalk and definitely love to have you back. Most of all, just thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.